Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 7, Day 8. Today's journal is going to be talking about things from the West that we talked about yesterday and in Day 6. And make sure that you are getting these journals down each day. Today's is what are some reasons the West expanded during the late 1800s, what were some positives about working in the West, and what were some negative aspects. I'd also like you to talk about Frederick Jackson Turner and his thesis about the frontier, and just explain a little bit more on that. Now, today we're going to be talking about Native American struggles. We're going to be moving through Day 8, and what were the effects of Western settlement in the United States. Now, the conquest of Native Americans is one of great tragedy, unfortunately. The policy of the federal government regarded tribes as independent nations, and that was, that Native Americans were not one big group that was all the same. They regarded them as individuals. And they even designed a policy to keep a boundary between Native Americans and settlers. The problem was the policies weren't strong enough. There wasn't enough enforcement against settlers going into Native American lands or attacking Native Americans. It really was almost kind of a gray area in our government. Now, between 1850 and 1880, we begin the Indian Wars. And this is, there's going to be a few things that happen after 1880. For the most part, this is going to be the time span in which the Indians are attacking settlers, the settlers are attacking Indians, and you're just having a lot of fighting out in the West over land and territory. And as time goes, the U.S. military begins to get more involved, and the attacks become much more focused between soldiers and Native Americans. The scene that I remember, and many of you probably never seen it, but Back to the Future 3, when Marty goes back to 1885, it shows the Native Americans running away and the cavalry chasing them. That's kind of the vision I think a lot of people have of the American West when they start studying it. And in some ways it's not untrue, but in some ways it's a little bit dramatized. However, many of the Native Americans signed treaties trying to keep the peace and trying to stay out of the wars. And these were just agreements to live within federal reserves, and so they would basically take and plot off a section of land. And I mean, it's a big chunk, but they would give them a section of land they could settle, live, practice their religion, etc. But the problem was, generally with these agreements, they were also forced to assimilate. And that just means, we talked about that in American History 1, but assimilation is taking on the characteristics of the people around you. They were forced to become like the white settlers who were around them, rather than being able to keep their culture, whether it was losing Christianity or converting to Christianity and losing their tribal practices, etc. Now, some of the battles and some of the negative things that took place during this time period is what we're going to kind of go through now. The first was the Sand Creek Massacre, and it took place in eastern Colorado. And the peaceful Arapaho natives and Cheyenne Native Americans were invited to camp near Fort Leon. And essentially what they were trying to do is, there was a lot of hostility in the area, and the general and the people there at Fort Leon basically convinced the Native Americans that were peaceful, that weren't fighting, to come stay so that they didn't get caught up in the massacre. And Black Kettle, the leader of the Native American tribes of the Arapaho and Cheyenne Indians, he believed them. He thought there would be no hostile intentions. He thought he trusted them. The problem is that one of the U.S. colonels, Chivington, him and a bunch of drunk militiamen murdered almost 133 Native Americans, 105 women and children, while they slept. And, stories like this are not uncommon with Native Americans. I think a lot of times we look at various groups who have suffered in our country. And, African Americans, of course, women, Hispanics in the 1940s and 50s and 60s who were immigrants. There's a lot of different groups that have suffered throughout American history, but I think when you really get down to it, Native Americans may have had the rawest deal, just for the fact that Native Americans were already here. They already had their land. And then somebody came in and took it. Like, they had their lives. They had already made their claims. In American society today, if they had done what they'd done and we came over, they would have been able to keep every bit of their land. It would have been theirs. But Black Kettle does manage to escape the massacre, but is eventually killed 4 years later by General Custer, and we'll talk about we'll talk about him and his forces. I should have said Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, but anyways. So, George Custer was the leader of a group of men who basically hunted Native Americans in the West, and he was responsible for much of the destruction of the Cheyenne tribe. And as a result, many Sioux had also joined the Native American cause of fighting back, and had joined specifically two leaders, Chief Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who were two of the main kind of guys there with Native Americans. And June 1876, the Battle at Little Bighorn takes place, and Custer marches his forces thinking that the Sioux natives were smaller in number, perhaps, but also thinking that he was strong enough and that he had the power to defeat almost three times his forces. And unfortunately, him and his 700 men are killed quite rapidly. And the only problem here is that the Sioux warriors could not actually unite. And we'll get to Sitting Bull's death later on, but the big problem here is they kept dividing off into small factions. Some were, they'd go raid these settlers for food, or this would go attack somebody because they felt like they had been, discriminated against by another group of settlers who had came and attacked their tribe. I mean, there's all numbers of situations that went on here. Now, during this time between the 1850s and 1880s, many Native Americans took part in what was known as the Ghost Dance, and it was just a powerful religious movement, and it gave hope to Native Americans. And some of the things that they saw during these ghost dances that they had is kind of almost like a spiritual vision, I guess you could call it, of they would see that things were going to change and they were going to go back to the traditional ways, and that their society would come back. That they had these visions of white settlers retreating, restoration of the buffalo herds, and we haven't talked a lot about that, but one of the ways that they pushed Native Americans off their land was to destroy the buffalo herds. And they also ran into problems because even in their reservations, even in their being away from the white settlers, many times white agents who were on reservations or were near reservations would basically spy on the Native Americans and then tell the armies that they were hostile because they feared the dance. They feared how they were dancing around and thought they were, getting ready to attack. Now, the Dawes Act of 1887, the government broke up Native American lands, and so a lot of that comes with the death of Sitting Bull and some of those things we'll talk about in a second. The problem with the land that they did break up and give back to the Native Americans under the Dawes Act is that most of it was not suitable for farming, and a lot of times the Native Americans didn't understand the value of what they did have. Even though it wasn't suitable for farming, it was valuable in some way, and so the land ends up being sold to speculators. And I don't know if you remember or not, but speculators were those people who buy up land and then try to sell it at a much higher price. And by 1934, something like 65% of all Native American land was sold to other people. Now, the buffalo, I told you, are going extinct. Settlers reduced the land for grazing because, they can't let their cattle, they can't let the wild herds of buffalo roam the plains anymore because they're getting pushed off the land that settlers are taking. There's also livestock diseases that are killing the buffalo that, are spreading and they don't have an immunity to. And the U.S. government encouraged settlers to kill them in order to drive Plains Indians to reservations. So the U.S. government wants these Native Americans on reservations. They want them to move. And by killing the buffalo, you're taking one of their greatest food sources and resources in the United States. So, brings us to the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890. This is where Sitting Bull was finally killed after years and years and years of fighting back. The soldiers were just trying to arrest various leaders of the Sioux tribe, including Sitting Bull, and shots end up being fired, and before it's all said and done, the soldiers end up killing over 200 unarmed Sioux natives. So whether they, somebody shot an arrow or threw a tomahawk or shot a gun or whatever, something happened that caused these soldiers to start firing at these Sioux natives, and as a result, the Native Americans were pretty much mowed down. As the term suggests, it's not good. And during this time, the U.S. military had some new technology. They had the power of a new machine gun. It's not machine guns like what we think, but it's kind of like a crank machine gun. It shoots bullets much more rapidly. Now, to give you an idea of the amount of buffalo they killed, this is a pile of buffalo skulls and bones. I just want you to think about how many buffalo they killed, how just in some ways dumb that really is, that you're killing off a population of meat for sheer sport to destroy another people, when in reality that population of animals could potentially help you in the future. It just makes no sense. So the Dawes Act plan, just to kind of give you an idea of what it actually did, the head of each family of Native Americans would receive 160 acres. When their sons would turn 18, they would get 80 acres, the first son obviously, and then his son would get 40 acres. And so essentially they handed down the land to the head of each family. Now, assimilation was pushed by whites during this time. Native American children were sent to boarding schools that were run by whites. They tried to stop their religious rituals and their religious practices and forced Christianity on the Native Americans. The problem of the Dawes Act and the bigger issue here is that Native Americans had nothing. And they had a ton of, they had a great deal of things prior to white settlers coming into the West, and even white settlers in, going all the way back to Jamestown and Plymouth. But now, by, late 1800s, and especially when we get into the 1930s, when the Dawes Act is repealed, things are bad for Native Americans. By 1934, the Native Americans that, the same tribes that we had been talking about, they had the highest levels of alcoholism in the country, illiteracy, could not read, poverty, and suicide. They were higher than any other group in our country in those areas. And that's a shame. It's, do we live in a great country? Sure. But it's sad that we had to trample all over another group of people and other groups of people in order to get our country to where it is. So, that's all I have for you today. No vocabulary. If you have any questions, please let me know.